Hello and welcome to the next APUSH video here on YouTube for period 7. This one is going to deal briefly with the New Deal. Now in class we've already talked about the stock market crash of October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday, which leads us into the Great Depression. You should also have read your Wrong Man at the Wrong Time article that dealt with Herbert Hoover and how he tried to do some things to alleviate the pain that comes with the Great Depression, but it was just a little bit too little and a little too late. But what he does is he opens the door to the next president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, and his public works program campaign that he called collectively the New Deal. So we're going to just look at the concepts here in 7.1 Roman numeral 3 that deal specifically with this and talk about some of the ways you can use some examples for this. We'll have a class lecture that'll get a little bit more into some of these things, but this will give you a nice overview of the New Deal. First of all, here it is in letter A of the key concept. It tells you this is Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. This is his domestic agenda that he called a New Deal. Remember his famous cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, called it a square deal, right? He had his 3 C's, right? Corporation, consumer protection, and conservation. Excuse me, I'm having a little bit of an iced tea issue here, so if I stop to take a nice refreshing beverage break, you should do the same thing right about now. Just pause it and have whatever you'd like. There you go. Glad to have you back. All right. So, as I was saying, he's kind of taking this a little bit from his cousin Theodore, the square deal. He's talking about now America needs a New Deal. And whenever we're talking in history about Roosevelt's New Deal, it always comes in 3 R's. We always call it the 3 R's. Relief, recovery, reform. And we're going to talk very specific about what relief, recovery, reform means. These are various public work programs that over the first 4 years, especially of his term, and then going into his second 4 years, you're going to get as many of these public work programs as they could possibly come up with and try to stimulate the economy, shock the economy back into growth. Relief is usually something immediate, something we're going to do short term, and it's often to the poor or to those without jobs or the homeless. Recovery is the one that could be either short term or long term, but recovery is designed normally to try to stimulate something. Some sector of the economy has fallen and we need to recover it and bring it back. Whereas reform, generally speaking, and I say generally, is a long-term situation. Some part of the economy needs to be completely reformed and changed for as long as you can change it. As you'll come to find out, much of Roosevelt's, FDR's New Deal is still with us to this day, the reform part of it. Again, the 3 R's, both short range and long range. After he gives his famous inaugural address, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Awesome. We don't need to be afraid of fear, but we need to be afraid of fear. Something, I don't know what that means, but it's a fun little quote. Within a couple of days after his inaugural address, Roosevelt starts right to work. We get a national banking holiday. He closed all the banks in America for a week. This is the beginning of what's known as his 100 Days Congress, where, and I don't know if it's an exact 100 days, but we call it the first 100 days of his first year in office. This Congress is going to create more legislation than any other Congress combination president administration in our history. I know there are some presidents who think that they've done just as much, if not as more. They haven't. But this becomes historical. And he starts with a national banking holiday. He closes all the banks. That way, people can't keep running on the bank and try and take their money out, because that's a problem. Throughout this 100-day situation, this is going to become an issue. This is going to be an expression I want you to remember, a blank check. If you think about the relationship between the legislative branch, the executive branch. Legislative branch makes law. Executive branch executes law. But the executive branch, which is the president, legislative is Congress, doesn't mean that the president can't suggest laws. He just can't make them. Or can he? See, this is one of the things that's going to become a problem for the New Deal. Congress basically is controlled by the Democratic Party. FDR is a Democrat, and they give them what we call a blank check. In other words, you tell us whatever it is you want to create for law, and we'll just start creating law, getting these papers out so you can sign it, create as many of these various agencies and public work programs that we can possibly come up with, and just see if something can stimulate the economy. Remember, I told you in class what FDR is trying to have certain dictatorial powers similar to Abraham Lincoln. He feels that this is a crisis that this country's in, and as president, he should have broad executive powers, as we'll come to see he mentions in his inaugural address. This is going to come back to become a problem for him later on, and we'll talk specifically about the blank check issue in class. One of the ways that Roosevelt was very good with keeping people calm, he had a series of what he called fireside chats. Radio, right? Radio is the big technology of the day. He would often sit at the radio. In the wintertime, you could hear the fire in the background going, hence the term fireside chats. Now, sometimes in history, we kind of think that, oh, he must have given this a weekly program or maybe a couple times a week. Actually, only gave a few of these. He only gave them when he thought it was really important, but Americans loved it. It was the President of the United States, for the first time, is going to the airwaves as often as he can. Again, it's not a lot of times, but it's a few times, belaying our fears, right? Telling us we're all in it together. And he's very calm and he's very soothing, especially if you could hear, if you think about what a fire sounds like in the background, the ambers and the crackling of the wood. It came across like father or grandfather just telling you, it's going to be okay. I'm going to tuck you in at night. This became a powerful tool for FDR, something that presidents in the future will use television to try to do. Now, if you remember, we talked about how Wall Street and the banks were able to collude in the 1920s, getting people to buy inflated stocks, creating this thing called buying on credit without telling people they had a call on credit or call on margin. And that became a problem. That was one of the big factors of the Great Depression, the stock market crash. Well, a very, very important law gets passed in 1933, the Glass-Steagall Act. This law basically forbids the banking industry and Wall Street to come together to try to create for themselves wealth at the expense of us. This became a very powerful law that will exist all the way into the end of Bill Clinton's administration, when they'll finally repeal Glass-Steagall, and banks and Wall Street, well, instead of colluding when it comes to the stock market in the early 2000s, instead they'll use real estate. Yeah, that turned out really good for us again, didn't it? Yeah. I like how Mark Twain famously said, history doesn't actually repeat, but it sure does rhyme a lot, right? One of the things that comes out of Glass-Steagall Act is the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Commission. If you have a savings account or a checking account right now, your bank somewhere has a sticker on the window that says FDIC. That means when you put money in a bank today, it is insured by the federal government. That is one of these reforms that we have until this day. At that time, it was up to $5,000 because, again, this is the 1930s. I believe it's somewhere around $250,000, maybe it could be up to $300,000 today that your money is insured. If the bank goes bankrupt, the federal government insures your money up until that amount of money, and you will get it back. That's why very, very wealthy people do not put all their money into one bank and they diversify their investments. But for you and I, this is a great thing because most of us bank only in the one bank. He also began to, well, he didn't begin to demand or something, that's not how I want to say it, but he ordered all private ownership of gold to be surrendered to the federal government. Up until now, America's been on a gold standard. People could get gold coin, a dollar gold coin, and they could buy and sell with this. No more. They had to turn in every gold coin they had. It was replaced with paper. Then he took America officially off the gold standard. This is what he called managed currency. If you remember, during the populist movement, they wanted to inflate the money system with paper. This is what he's going to do. Help relieve debtors. But it does cause inflation. But he also increases the price of gold from $21 an ounce to $35 an ounce. You may remember in the populist movement, it was 16 ounces to 1 ounce of silver. Now gold is going up. Eventually, a year later, we do go back on a gold standard, but not for you and me. Paper dollars will no longer say redeemable in gold. They'll be for trade purposes only. And that's going to be something when we get to World War II and beyond, that's going to be very important too. So this is how we come off the gold system, is when he takes all that gold. Now, where'd all that gold go? Well, he melts it down. Well, not him personally. He's not like getting there and, in a smelting factory himself. But, it's going to be melt down into gold bars. And then they have to have a vault for all of this. Well, there's a fort in Kentucky called Fort Knox. Not in the fort, but off the fort, they're going to build a massive underground vault. And there's where all the gold goes. And it's still there to this day. Maybe. We're not sure. No one's seen it in a while, but I think it's there. Kind of scared right now. All right, moving along. Keynesian economics. This is important to take note of this because America has been practicing what we call laissez-faire economics from Adam Smith, who was a British economist who wrote a book called Wealth of Nations in 1776. You might remember that year. That's the same year of the Declaration of Independence. And ever since then, most of the Western European powers and the United States practiced this hands-off concept when it came to the economy and government. John Maynard Keynes, another British economist, becomes the only economist to ever have a discipline of economics named after him. We call it Keynesian. He comes up with this idea that governments must be fully invested in the economy. Governments have to help provide jobs. Governments must be the biggest spenders of the economy. When the government does this stuff, it stimulates the economy and it gives us trust in the economy. We call this demand-side economy. I'm not going to go into all the specific details of Keynesian. Next year, when you take economics, you'll get this a little bit more. But from this point on, the United States is no longer purely laissez-faire. From this point until today, America practices Keynesian. Actually, it's more of a mixed bag at times. There's a little laissez-faire. There's a little monetarist theory. There's a little Keynesian. But we're never going to go back to that full-on laissez-faire stuff. At least I don't think so. We'll move on. So again, staying in 713A, talking about this relief, recovery, reform, one of the things you are going to have to get used to when it comes to the New Deal is this thing we call the alphabet soup. FDR loves acronyms, and there are dozens and dozens of these acronyms. Does that mean you have to memorize them all? No, not really. But you do have to memorize a few of them. There are some that are very, very important. The CCC, for instance, Civilian Conservation Corps. Here, and I have the little poster here, they put young men to work, ranging from like 18 to like 24, I think. They went to work in the national forestry. They put out forest fires. They dug ditches. They cut down trees. They cleaned roadsides. They put thousands and thousands of these young men to work in the CCC. And what you did is when you went to work here, when you got your paycheck, a portion of your paycheck had to go back home to your parents. You couldn't keep all your money. This was a way to offset if your father couldn't get a job. Now you could go get a job working in the forestry, and some of your money could go back home to help pay the mortgage. It was treated like a boot camp. You may notice this little image here where they're giving a bugle call. You lived in barracks. You had to make your bed like you were in the army. You got up at the crack of dawn. Everyone had their breakfast together, and everyone went to work together, and everyone came and had lunch together, and everyone went to bed. It's just like being in the military. And in some respects, might have helped train some of these guys for a few years later when, that World War II thing comes along. We get the Federal Emergency Relief Act is passed. We're going to talk about some of these specifically in class. The AAA is another one of these acronyms, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Here we have this massive surplus we talked about in class the other day, where farmers kept growing and we have all this grain and all this corn. Well, we have to eat down this supply. So they begin to pay farmers not to grow food. This becomes very controversial, and we're going to talk about this one specifically in class as well. You get the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and out of this you get the FHA, the Federal Housing Act, which we still have to this day. That's one of these reform situations. New home owners, a new home buyer, normally you get an FHA loan. This is a federal loan you get from the government to help you buy a house for the first time. Starts here in the New Deal. Civil Works Administration. This is just to name a few of these. I'm going to give you a cheat sheet in class the next time we're together, and it's going to have the majority of these all on here and what they are and what they did. But these are all these public work programs that are created by this thing we call the New Deal. The concept, the name of it's called the New Deal. But all of these are just examples of what these work programs were, and we'll go into them more specifically in class. It's not all rosy. Not everybody liked FDR. Radicals, labor unions, and populist movements are emerging. They felt that Roosevelt didn't go far enough to the left. He is a progressive. He's an extreme progressive, more so than Woodrow Wilson, obviously so. Very liberal, but there are some who want him to go as far as socialism. For instance, Senator Huey Long, the Kingfish of Louisiana, and this is him over here. He's a very popular, hence a populist movement. He begins the Share Our Wealth program. He begins to preach that every rich person in America needs to pool money together and give it to every poor person in America, or give a portion. I think it was like $5,000 a year to every poor person in America. Share our wealth. Yeah, that sounds very socialism. At first, he supported FDR in his first term, and then he starts to kind of preach against him. He is going to wind up assassinated. He's shot to death in his hometown on August 10th, 1935. It's very controversial to this day. There's been movies made about this, none recently. I think the last one's about 15 years ago, starring Sean Penn, and a lot of you don't even know who that is anymore, right? Yeah, but he was a huge, bigger-than-life figure at the time period. And, of course, what I want you to remember is what is the Share Our Wealth program. Francis Townshend began to preach what we call old age pension. Now, this is one of the ones that FDR is actually going to listen to. And in his second term, in FDR's second term, we're going to get the Social Security Act passed. So old age pension was what this guy was preaching for when you retire and you're old, you should have some sort of a pension plan from the government, and that becomes our Social Security, which again is one of these long-term reforms. Then there's Father Charles Coughlin. Oh, Father Coughlin. I don't want to get too much into this. I might come back to this during World War II. Very controversial figure. Begins to give a lot of very powerful speeches on the radio. He has a massive following in America until they start to find out that a lot of his speeches are almost word for word from a guy in Germany named Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda. Turns out Coughlin, it becomes obvious he becomes very anti-Semitic. At the time period, he's starting to preach more Nazi thoughts. And eventually Coughlin, he's going to become very unpopular once they start to figure out what his true motives are. But these are just a few of these individuals who are these radicals and these populists that begin to speak against a little bit or trying to make FDR go even further to the left. I have a ... here because there's a second part to B that talks about the Supreme Court, We're going to do that one in class, so I'm going to skip that part. I'm going to go to the end here. Here it tells us in our concepts, although the New Deal did not end the Depression, and this is true, it doesn't end the Depression. It does help alleviate a lot of things. It put into place a lot of mechanisms where the government can help people better, but it left a legacy of reform and regulatory agencies. We get a lot of agencies that are going to be developed to help regulate business and other aspects of our life. It tells you there's long-term political realignment. Many African Americans start to become solid now in the Democratic Party. A lot of working class white people also begin to identify strongly with the Democratic Party at this time, which this second part here will change in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan comes along. I love this political cartoon here. Think for a second, what does this look like? What in your world history would you have seen a giant horse-like animal being snuck into giant gates with people hiding inside of it? Yes, the Trojan Horse. I knew someone would say it. The Trojan Horse. But this is not a horse. It's the donkey or the jackass of the Democratic Party. Here are New Dealers hiding inside of it, and it's New Deal tyranny. The Constitution of the United States is the gate that they're trying to get into. You have the American citizens with their spears. I hope you understand this would be an anti-New Deal political cartoon, predominantly a Republican conservative view. Over the next 60-some years, Republicans are going to try to do everything they can to dismantle the New Deal. But like I said, there's still parts of it. Social Security is still with us to this day. And there's some other things we're going to talk about in class that we also still have. All right, like I said, this is a brief, quick overview. I'll see you in class very shortly. Bye-bye.